In the winter of 1940, the night skies over Europe had become a theater of terror. From the English coast to the forests of the Rhineland, the air was alive with a constant hum. The drone of bombers, the searchlights slicing the darkness, and the far-off thunder of explosions that seemed to shake the very soul of civilization. But before the Germans built the sophisticated radar webs and command centers that would later define their war machine, they relied on something far older, almost medieval: the ringing of church bells. At first it sounds like folklore. Bells, the ancient messengers of joy and mourning, turned into instruments of war. Yet for a time, those bronze giants swinging in steeples across the Reich became the nervous system of an entire nation's early warning network. It began in the small towns, places where the Luftwaffe wardens, local policemen, and even priests became the first responders to a new kind of warfare. The air raid siren was still a rarity then, but bells, every village had them. Bells were loud, trusted, and immediate. When the British bombers crossed the Channel, their engines were the distant growl of an oncoming storm. Villagers on the coast, trained by Luftwaffe officers, would strain their ears to catch the direction of that sound. Then the bells would begin. A single toll for sighting, 2 for direction, 3 for confirmed approach. And just like that, across the night landscape, bells answered bells. A chain of sound that traveled faster than any runner, faster even than the telegraph lines that might be destroyed or silent under blackout. The bells told a story, one of dread, vigilance, and strange devotion. In a small town near Bremen, a man named Karl Fischer was the keeper of St. Anna's Church. Before the war, he'd been a watchmaker, patient, precise, obsessed with time and rhythm. Now, his job was to listen. Every night, Karl climbed the narrow staircase of the bell tower, where the cold crept through the stone like fingers. From that height, he could see the faint shimmer of the North Sea, and beyond it, the horizon where death might come from. He had a map pinned to the wall beside the bell ropes, marked with small red pins. Each pin stood for another village in the bell network, places that would ring when the aircraft were heard. It was a fragile symphony of warning, made not by machines, but by men. Sometimes he could feel the tower tremble when the bells rang, a deep vibration that moved through his chest and bones. And in that trembling, he thought he could feel the pulse of the nation itself, fearful, but awake. At Luftwaffe headquarters in Hanover, officers huddled over wall-sized maps as the bells tolled in the distance. Reports came in through the field phones, 3 rings from Cuxhaven, 2 from Oldenburg. Each signal meant another step closer. It wasn't science, not yet, but it worked. The bells formed an acoustic radar of sorts, a human echo network. The rhythm and timing between the chimes allowed triangulation of the bomber paths, crude but effective enough for fighter squadrons to be scrambled from nearby fields. An officer would press his pencil into the paper map, drawing thin lines converging like spider silk toward a single point, where the sound, the time, and the bells all met. And in the airfields beyond, pilots were already running to their Messerschmitts. The church bells had become a warning heartbeat, guiding steel predators into the sky. But there was something haunting about it. The sound of faith turned into a weapon. Even among the soldiers, the practice felt unsettling. Some priests refused to participate, calling it a desecration. Others obeyed, saying the bells belonged to the people, and the people belonged to survival. In a letter discovered years later, a Luftwaffe warden from Kiel wrote, "Each time the bells ring, I think of funerals. Yet it is not the dead they mourn, but the living they try to save." In those words lies the strange poetry of war, how tools of peace become shields, how the sacred becomes tactical. As the raids intensified, the bell system grew more sophisticated. The Germans began logging the acoustic intervals between bell chimes to calculate distance and bearing. It was not unlike how submarines listened for sonar echoes beneath the waves. Young radio operators learned to synchronize bell signals with flight reports, marking times to the nearest second. The more data they gathered, the clearer the pattern became. Altitude could be inferred from how faint the drone was when the first bells began to ring. One scientist in Berlin, Dr. Heinrich Mader, even proposed using specially tuned bells that could detect resonance changes caused by low-frequency vibrations from aircraft engines, a strange precursor to radar research. His theory was dismissed at first, but his notes later influenced acoustic detection systems along the Atlantic Wall. The bells were primitive, but they were teachers. They taught the Germans how sound traveled through wind, through fog, through terror. One night in March 1941, the bells began too early. Karl Fischer heard them first, faint, uncertain, like whispers carried by the wind. He hesitated. The official orders said not to ring unless confirmed. But something in his gut told him the enemy was coming sooner than expected. He rang once, twice, then 3 times. The sound leapt across the countryside, calling to its brothers in other towers. Within minutes, the whole region was alive with a wild, urgent chorus. Moments later, the first wave of British bombers passed overhead, far earlier than intelligence had predicted. The warning allowed several towns to go dark before the bombs fell. The casualties were fewer that night. Karl never knew how many lives those 3 tolls saved. The next morning, when the sun rose pale over the rubble, the bells were still swinging, their bronze mouths blackened by soot, their ropes burned at the ends. But still, they moved. The system was never perfect. Sound could deceive. Wind could carry it in strange ways. Sometimes bells rang when no bombers came, false alarms that sent whole towns into panic. Sometimes, worse, silence fell when danger was real. By 1942, radar had begun to replace the bells entirely. The human ear gave way to cathode screens and oscillating lines. Yet even as technology took over, many German towns kept their watchers in the towers, not for orders, but for memory. They said that when the bells rang, the people listened. And when they listened, they remembered that the war was not somewhere far away. It was above them, around them, within earshot of their own prayers. Years later, in the archives of a demolished Luftwaffe base, historians found maps covered in tiny hand-drawn circles and notes in faded ink. Confirmed by Bell Network, 0.17. It was a relic of a desperate time, when fear and ingenuity had forged a strange alliance. And though the church bells of Europe ring today for peace, the echoes of that dark experiment still linger, a reminder that in the machinery of war, even faith can be drafted into service. The same sound that once called men to worship had once guided them to battle. And in that echo, history listens back. The war deepened. By 1942, the night sky above Germany had become a constant battlefield, a theater of fire where strategy met endurance. The church bell network, once the beating heart of early warning, now lingered in the shadows of a new, colder science, radar. Yet in hundreds of towns and villages, those bells still hung waiting, their bronze throats silent but alert, like sentinels standing watch over a vanishing world. Karl Fischer remained in his tower. Though official orders now came through radio transmitters and radar stations, the Ministry of the Interior had not ordered the bells dismantled. As a secondary precaution, they wrote, but Karl knew it was more than that. The bells were comfort, a reminder of familiarity in a war that was rapidly becoming inhuman. Still, he noticed the change. The soldiers who once came to his church to check bearings or mark reports on maps now arrived less often, their visits brisk, their faces tight with exhaustion. The sound of engines overhead had grown deeper, heavier, no longer the scattered growl of a few bombers, but the relentless thunder of fleets. The war was turning industrial. The air, once ruled by instinct and sound, now belonged to machines and mathematics. One evening, under a blood-orange sky, Karl stood at the top of St. Anna's and watched as a column of trucks rolled through the cobbled streets below. On their sides were stenciled letters, Nachtjäger Staffel 5, Night Fighter Squadron. Their planes, painted black and bristling with antennas, waited in a nearby field. He had heard of these aircraft. Twin-engine Messerschmitts fitted with early radar, able to hunt bombers through darkness and cloud. Pilots called them the eyes of the night. To Karl, they felt like an omen. The bells, it seemed, were being replaced not by progress alone, but by a new kind of faith. Faith in circuitry, in invisible waves that could see where human eyes could not. Yet the irony remained. Those invisible waves had first been inspired by listening. The entire science of radar, the Germans called it Funkmessgerät, had roots in acoustics, in listening to echoes, in men like Karl who once strained to hear the distant hum of war. It was as if the bells themselves had given birth to the machines that would silence them. Still, in the towns, the people trusted the bells more than they trusted the technology of Berlin. To them, radar was a whisper from faraway laboratories. Bells were the voice of home. When the sirens failed, the bells still rang. When electricity died, they still rang. When the telephone lines were severed, the bells were all that remained. In Cologne, during one of the worst raids of 1943, entire neighborhoods burned while the city's great cathedral shook under the impact of high explosives. Amid the fire and ruin, its bells began to swing, slow, deliberate, tolling through the chaos. Not as a warning this time, but as defiance. Eyewitnesses would later write that the sound carried through the smoke like a heartbeat. The bells rang even as shards of glass fell around them, even as the roof of the nave caved in. It was, one survivor recalled, as if the city itself refused to go silent. Far to the north, in the coastal outpost of Flensburg, a small Luftwaffe acoustic research unit operated from an abandoned monastery. Its lead engineer, Captain Dieter Weiss, was obsessed with sound. His men called him the listener. He believed that the war's future lay not only in radar, but in mastering how the ear perceived movement. The monastery's stone halls echoed with strange experiments. Massive trumpet-shaped detectors pointed toward the sea, and suspended bronze plates that resonated when distant engines passed. Weiss had even ordered the bells in the nearby chapel to be tuned to precise frequencies so that they would vibrate when bombers approached at specific altitudes. To an outsider, it looked like madness, a symphony of science and superstition. But Weiss saw purpose in it. Every vibration, he told his staff, is history speaking. On stormy nights, when waves pounded the coast and thunder rolled across the fjord, the bells would hum faintly without being touched. Weiss would close his eyes, listening. To him, the war had become a dialogue between man, machine, and the air itself. In Berlin, as the Allied raids intensified, the Reich Ministry of Armaments sought to catalogue everything that could serve the defense, even sound. A secret memorandum titled Akustisches Frühwarnsystem, Glockenversuch, Acoustic Early Warning, Bell Experiment, circulated briefly before being buried in classified archives. The report praised the rural bell network for its role in the early phase of the war, but concluded that emotional interference made it unreliable. The line was bureaucratic, but it revealed a truth. Men and women who heard the bells did not always respond like soldiers. They responded like humans, with fear, with hesitation, with memory. And in a war increasingly ruled by cold precision, emotion had no place. Yet, somewhere beneath that efficiency, the old ways endured. When communication lines fell to bombing or sabotage, commanders still ordered the use of bells as fallback signals. Some towns combined them with flares, others with coded patterns of light in church windows, a mosaic of ancient and modern signals that spoke the same desperate language. The enemy is coming. By late 1944, Germany itself was collapsing. The once great networks of radar, of command, of supply were frayed and broken. But the bells still hung in their towers. In countless villages, the priests refused to let them be melted down for weapons, though many were. The bronze of old sanctuaries was recast into shells and propeller blades, their engravings lost to the foundries of war. When Karl Fischer received the order to surrender his bells to the armaments ministry, he stood alone in the tower for hours, touching the cool metal surface. He traced the carved Latin inscription along the rim, Pax Domini, sit semper vobiscum. The peace of the Lord be always with you. He thought of how far they had fallen from that promise. Then, without ceremony, he pulled the clapper's rope one final time. The sound rolled through the valley, soft, steady, neither warning nor prayer, just memory. The next day, workers came with torches and chains. St. Anna's bells were lowered and carted away. Karl watched from the doorway, hands trembling. He would never hear them again. But not all bells were lost. In some occupied territories, partisans and resistance groups had repurposed them, not for German defense, but for coded warnings against German patrols. In Belgium, the village of Orp-le-Grand used its church bell to signal Allied parachute drops. In the Polish countryside, the bells rang to confuse Luftwaffe spotters, deliberately creating false echoes in the night. Even as the Reich tried to control sound, sound rebelled. In those final months, chaos reigned not just on the ground, but in the air itself. The same air that once carried messages of warning now carried confusion, deception, and grief. When the last Luftwaffe units retreated, the bells were silent. For the first time in 5 years, the night belonged only to wind and the distant growl of retreating engines. Karl, by then an old man in spirit though not yet in age, sat inside his empty tower and listened to the silence. It was louder than any bell he had ever rung. When the war ended in May 1945, the surviving bells were returned, at least those that hadn't been melted down or shattered. Some came back cracked, others blackened by fire. But they were welcomed home like veterans. Karl received a single bell from the ministry, not his, but one salvaged from another destroyed church. He hoisted it back into St. Anna's Tower and rang it on the day of Germany's surrender. The sound was strange, uneven, almost broken, yet it carried a kind of peace. Villagers gathered below, tears mixing with relief and exhaustion. For the first time in years, the bells rang not for warning, but for the end of fear. And as the echoes drifted across the valley, Karl realized something profound. Even after all that destruction, sound had survived. The same vibrations that once signaled death now heralded rebirth. The war had silenced so much, but not the will to be heard. In the quiet years that followed the war, Europe became a continent of echoes. Burned cities whispered to the wind, rivers carried the reflection of shattered bridges, and the surviving bells, those rare, miraculous survivors, began to ring again. Their notes drifted over ruins and fields alike, mingling with the cries of children who had never known peace until then. For men like Karl Fischer, the sound was both healing and haunting. The first time he heard a full peal after the surrender, his knees nearly gave way. The tone was pure and bright, but beneath it he could still hear the ghosts of wartime, the coded tolls, the desperate rhythm of alarms. To most villagers, the bells meant hope reborn. To Karl, they carried memory, a burden he could neither silence nor fully bear. Still, he tended to them faithfully. Every morning he climbed the rebuilt staircase of St. Anna's Tower, now scarred but standing. He polished the bronze, adjusted the ropes, and wound the old clock that still ticked with stubborn precision. He would look out across the valley and see smoke rising, not from bombings now, but from hearths and bakeries. The world was trying, painfully, to remember how to live. And as it did, it began to ask questions. In 1946, a small group of Allied historians and sound engineers visited northern Germany. Their mission was to document how the Reich had developed its early warning systems: radar, radio, and the so-called Glockennetzwerk, the bell network. They interviewed survivors, engineers, priests, even farmers, who had once taken part in those night watches. Karl met them at the tower door, his hands still blackened with soot from the rope grease. He spoke simply, without pride or shame. He told them how the bells had once been his duty, how the people trusted them more than orders, how sometimes when the sound echoed too long across the valleys, he imagined it was praying for the very bombers it warned against. One of the historians, an Englishman named Dr. Lawrence, was struck by his humility. "You turned faith into science," he said. Karl shook his head. "No," he replied. "We only tried to listen." Dr. Lawrence smiled faintly. "That," he said, "is the beginning of every science." In archives across Europe, fragments of the bell system's legacy began to emerge. Reports written in hurried pencil, diagrams of resonance patterns, even early recordings of bell tolls matched against aircraft flight logs. British intelligence officers, fascinated by the idea, compared them to their own sound mirror experiments from before the war, vast concrete dishes built along the coast to catch the noise of approaching aircraft. It seemed both sides had once trusted sound more than sight. Before radar, before electronics, there had been human hearing, fragile, instinctive, endlessly faithful. For years, researchers debated the system's true effectiveness. Some claimed it saved thousands of lives by giving towns precious minutes to seek shelter. Others dismissed it as folklore, an illusion of control in a time of chaos. But no one denied its symbolism, a civilization reaching back into its oldest traditions, using faith's instruments to confront the machinery of modern war. The bells had been both technology and theology, an alloy of fear and devotion. As Europe rebuilt, the bells became emblems of renewal. Some churches cast new ones from the melted remains of the old, mixing fragments of destroyed bronze into the fresh metal. They called them Friedensglocken, peace bells. In one ceremony in 1949, representatives from former enemy nations gathered as a new bell was raised into a reconstructed cathedral. When it rang, its voice was unlike any other, a deep, complex tone, carrying traces of every past it had known. Listeners said it sounded like forgiveness. Karl was there, standing quietly in the back of the crowd. He had been invited as a symbol of the bell watchers, the unsung volunteers who had guarded towns during the air raids. As the bell's sound rolled through the crowd, he felt something inside him uncoil. For the first time since the war, he closed his eyes without flinching. It was not joy he felt, but release. In the decades that followed, time softened the memory. Children born after the war heard stories of the bell networks as curiosities, almost legends. They would ask, did people really use church bells to find airplanes? And their elders would nod with a faraway look, unsure whether to smile or mourn. Historians continued to uncover small details. An order from a regional Luftwaffe office confirming the bell relay system in 1940. A priest's journal noting his reluctance to ring for war. The diary of a young girl who wrote that each time the bells sounded, she whispered a prayer, not for her safety, but for the pilots overhead, hoping they too might survive the night. Those fragments formed a mosaic of human contradiction, the way war bends every good thing toward survival, and yet somehow leaves room for compassion. In his later years, Karl rarely spoke of the war, but every Sunday, he would ring St. Anna's bells himself. His hands had grown stiff, but the rhythm remained perfect, steady, deliberate, reverent. Visitors often said there was something unusual in the sound, a weight, a depth that made people fall silent without knowing why. When asked about it once, Karl said quietly, "They remember." He meant the bells. To him, every vibration carried memory of storms, of fear, of faith. He believed that sound was not simply heard, but stored in stone, in air, even in the hearts of those who listened. And when those bells rang across the valley, he imagined they were speaking in a language only the past could understand. Karl Fischer died in the spring of 1963, in the same town where he had first climbed the tower as a young man. The villagers buried him in the churchyard beneath the shadow of St. Anna's steeple. On the day of his funeral, the bells tolled once, slow, low, and long. Their sound drifted over blooming fields, through the quiet streets, and up toward the clouds where aircraft no longer prowled. For a moment, time folded, and the world seemed to listen again. Not for warning, not for war, but for remembrance. Today, in museums of military history, visitors sometimes find displays about acoustic early warning systems. Among the concrete listening dishes and radar diagrams, there is often a small plaque describing the German bell network of 1940-41. Most walk past it quickly, assuming it was just an anecdote, a curiosity of desperate times. But those who linger and read the fine print find something deeper, a study in how even the instruments of peace can be pressed into the service of fear, and how, in that transformation, humanity leaves a trace of itself that never fades. For sound, unlike light, never truly disappears. It travels outward forever, growing faint but infinite, until one day, perhaps somewhere beyond our reach, it still whispers across the void. Perhaps even now, if one could listen closely enough, the faint echo of those bells still rings through the night sky. Not as an alarm, but as a remembrance of all who once listened for survival. And so the story of the bells ends not in silence, but in resonance. A nation listened, a people endured, and the sound that once signaled death became at last the anthem of endurance. In the stillness between each toll, there lies a truth older than war itself. That even in darkness, humanity will find a way to listen, and in listening to endure.